the end of the nightmare. An outpouring of raw emotion as the freed South Korean hostages are reunited with their families after 51 days of separation. But even the joy of reunion can't mask the pain of loss, because 2 of their friends will never return from Afghanistan. It had all started so differently. 7 weeks earlier, 23 volunteers posed for a photograph as they prepared to leave South Korea for a 10-day aid mission to Afghanistan. There was no hint of the tragedy to follow. The mother of Sao Myung-hwa and Sao Kyung-sok had mixed emotions as she contemplated her children's departure.
You know, as a parent, frankly speaking, I do not want to send them to dangerous areas, but I respect my children's choice because they are very trustworthy and because I know they are very good human beings. That's the reason why I will respect their stance if they want to go any place.
For Yoo Kyung-sik, the trip represented a journey of discovery after a lifetime spent working 9 to 5.
My husband was an engineer at a computer company for 30 years, and he left his job 3 years ago because he wanted to change his life. It was work, work, work. But after leaving his job, he began to realize that life is very important. His family lives and others' lives as well. And that is the reason he was planning to go to Afghanistan to find some way of helping them.
The volunteers were in Afghanistan to help sick children in some of the country's most deprived areas. On July the 19th, they boarded a bus in the Afghan capital, Kabul, and commenced a 500-kilometer journey to Kandahar. But they were never to reach their destination. Their bus was hijacked by members of the Taliban near the city of Ghazni. All 23 aid workers were taken hostage. For Lee Han-ja, the gravity of the situation was slow to hit home.
My husband came to me to inform me of the news. Together we watched the TV reports and my children's names were mentioned. But at first I didn't worry much because there were a large number of hostages and I thought the incident would be solved easily.
But Kwa Oh-kang, whose daughter Lu Chung-hwa was also among the party, immediately feared the worst.
I was driving in my car when I heard the news, and I guess it was probably about my daughter. So I called my youngest daughter to check the name list, and she said yes. She's being named and appears on the list. At that time, I felt my blood upside down, and the color of the sky seemed to change into yellow. It was a true shock, and I was very terrified.
And the following day, her worst fears were realized when it emerged that the hostages' fate seemed tied to the presence of some 200 South Korean military personnel serving in Afghanistan.
The Taliban has threatened to kill a group of more than 20 kidnapped Koreans unless Seoul withdraws its troops from Afghanistan within 24 hours.
But the deadline came and went, and for the horrified family members, the long wait had begun. They gathered at a church south of the capital Seoul, desperately hoping for news of their loved ones. The deadline was extended, but again expired without any agreement being reached. Lee Hyun-ja went to stay with her son-in-law, Sung Hyun, who had married her daughter just 7 months earlier.
It's painful for me to see him living alone like this, so I want to share the time with my son-in-law. That's my wish.
Together, they shared their hopes and their fears. At first, Sung Hyun was determined to stay strong.
When the kidnapping happened, I decided to not be weak or poor, not only for me, but for my parents and other members of the family.
But as he looked back on happier times, Sung Hyun's resolve began to weaken.
Try to not think about her. Without her, sleeping, awakening, eating, any other thing is not only meaningless, but so painful. The more I see this video or this picture, the more I feel pain about this real situation. All this material makes me so painful and so helpless.
As the South Korean government insisted that it would not bow to pressure from the Taliban, protesters took to the streets of Seoul, demanding the release of the 23 hostages. In Afghanistan, similar rallies took place. But if this groundswell of support was heartening for the families, any optimism would be short-lived. 6 days after the kidnapping, sickening reports emerged that one of the hostages had been killed. The body of 42-year-old pastor Pae Hyung-yu, the leader of the group, was found with bullet wounds to his head, chest and stomach. The families were devastated by the grim news.
All the family members burst into tears and even screamed with deep sorrow and agony, that kind of thing. We were very upset that he had died.
But even as the families mourned, Hyun-ja confessed to some conflicting feelings.
In some way, I felt myself relieved because my children were not killed.
In the days that followed, the country united in grief. Another round of frantic diplomatic activity took place as a nation grew desperate for some good news. And then, a week after the kidnapping, Kwa Oh-kang's daughter, Chung-hwa, made a phone call to the media. For Oh-kang, there was an initial sense of elation, but the joy was short-lived.
At the first moment, I was pleased to hear her voice, because at least she was alive. Soon after, I realized what a terrible situation she was in, far from home. And I could tell how miserable the situation was.
We are so scared. Sometimes they threaten us. They're going to kill us one by one. Please save us. I don't know what to say, but just please save us. We want to go home. We miss our family. We don't want to die. Please, please, really trust. Every day we cannot stand anymore.
But the ordeal was far from over. And in the days and weeks ahead, the families would have to face up to more bad news and further anguish. Today, South Korea is a prosperous nation. The futuristic architecture of its capital, Seoul, stands in stark contrast to the war-torn Afghan capital of Kabul. And yet, the two nations share common histories. Both spent much of the 20th century under occupation by foreign powers.
Korea is also geographically situated between big powers. Historically, we have been invaded many times by other countries. Because Afghanistan has also been invaded by other countries, Korean people particularly sympathize with them. This is the general feeling of the Korean people.
And just as Afghanistan is now one of the poorest nations in Asia, the same could have been said of Korea some 50 years ago. The Southeast Asian economic miracle transformed South Korea. This building, with its ultra-modern facade, seems to typify its 21st century optimism. But this converted shopping centre is actually home to the Semel Presbyterian Church. Based in Bundang, an hour south of Seoul, the church had become the focus of the relatives' hopes and fears as they spent each day together, anxiously awaiting updates on the fate of the captives.
We need some special space to get together, and that's why we are there. There are some helpers who provide the family members with food, information, and maybe some experts who advise us to be ready for the things that have been done.
But there was no way to prepare for two pieces of news that would arrive within hours of each other on day 12 of the hostage crisis. First, a video emerged showing some of the captives alive and apparently in good health. However, if these images provoked a sense of optimism amongst the families, reports of a death that began to circulate almost simultaneously brought further despair. And these rumours were soon confirmed when the body of 29-year-old Shim Song-min was discovered. For Nam Sung-soon, whose 36-year-old daughter Chi-young was among the hostages, the news was almost too much to bear.
The hardest thing was when I saw the news on the TV that Shin Song-min was killed, and I saw his body was covered by a blanket, and I could see part of his feet, and that was terrifying. A very terrible thing for me to watch. Really, I could hardly watch the TV because I was so shocked.
Of the 21 surviving hostages, 5 were men. The knowledge that both of the murdered captives were male only increased the sense of dread for Sung In-suk, who feared her husband might be next.
The family members who have female hostages are relatively optimistic. But for me and the other mothers whose sons are in there, there's more to worry about. Since the killings, I can't even begin to explain how I've been feeling.
For South Korea's Muslim community, there were fears of a backlash. Their leaders were keen to voice their opposition to the kidnappings.
Korean Muslim people cried when the 2 men were killed, and they delivered the condolences to the families. We hope that nobody else is killed.
Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, opposition was growing. At a meeting, or jirga, of tribal elders, there was strong criticism of the Taliban, particularly of the fact that they were holding women captive. Then, on August the 11th, day 24 of the crisis, the Taliban announced the release of 2 hostages. Hopes were raised, then dashed back in South Korea as it emerged that no release had taken place. The waiting continued. But 2 days later, the breakthrough came, as 2 hostages, Kim Gong-ja and Kim Ji-na, were set free. They had been held captive for 26 days. And yet, relief at their homecoming was tempered by apprehension for the fate of those left behind.
I felt joy when we were finally released, but the worry over the 19 people who are still captive is more intense, so it still feels very painful.
23 people went to Kandahar, but only 2 people came back. That makes me so sad. I care about, I worry about every single person who is still captive. And I'm just hoping that we can see each other again.
And one hostage in particular was on the minds of the 2 women. Yi Chi-young had been offered her freedom by the Taliban, but chose to stay behind so that her friends would be released instead. Chi-young's mother expressed pride in her daughter's decision.
I know that in terms of giving a chance to another person, she is a very good and warm-hearted woman. Kim Jina's mother and family told me that this morning and expressed their appreciation. I'm really proud of my daughter.
The Taliban had allowed Chi-young to write a letter to her family. As her mother read it aloud, she could no longer conceal her suffering.
이지영 부모님께 건강히 잘 있으니 걱정 마세요. 삶고 편히 있어요. 아프지 마시고 편히 계세요. 사랑하는 내 딸 지영아 빨리 돌아온다.
August the 21st, day 34 of the hostage crisis. With the days slipping into weeks, the relatives paid a visit to the Afghan embassy in Seoul.
I hope the Afghan government and Afghan people will cooperate with us for their release and will understand our situation. And I hope they will understand that our relatives traveled to Afghanistan to help the people. I wish that our message will be delivered through this appeal letter and this visit so that it will help them to be released soon.
They held a silent vigil before retreating to their makeshift base with no progress made. They had travelled in hope, but returned helpless and despondent, consumed by a sense of foreboding.
There have been several deadlines and 2 people were killed. It was such a sad thing and we were struggling with this feeling. But quite recently, yesterday or today, there was news that something terrible was on the way. So we are even more terrified than before.
Hunja's son-in-law was also struggling to cope without his wife.
How I love her. But the more I feel the pain, the more I know I love her. I can die instead of her, but I can't. It makes me more helpless and frustrating. I can't do anything for her.
For the families, a resolution seemed as distant as ever. But behind the scenes, the protracted negotiations were finally beginning to progress. And then, 40 days after the crisis began, the end was suddenly in sight.
The ordeal of 19 South Koreans looks like it's coming to an end. A tribal elder says the hostages will be let go in 3 or 4 days' time.
The atmosphere in the family's meeting room was transformed. After weeks of frustrations, events now moved quickly. The next day, 12 hostages were handed over to representatives of the Red Cross. The remaining 7 were delivered over the next 24 hours. For Sung In-suk, the waiting was almost over. Before flying home, her husband described the conditions of his captivity.
During the 42 days, we were relocated 12 times. They move us mainly during the night by motorcycles. They also turn off their headlights while moving. The owner of the house we were in was also a member of the Taliban, and he was holding a gun and guarding us. During the day, he locked the door and went to take care of his farm fields, and he guarded us with the gun during the night.
Sao Myung-hwa, whose husband and parents had shared the burden of her confinement, spoke of her gratitude and her guilt.
We caused so much anxiety to the people and our government. I feel really sorry and grateful to the people.
And Kwa Oh-kang could finally look forward to a happy homecoming with her daughter. But even as she did so, it was with a heavy heart.
When I see her, I will say I cannot begin to understand how much you have suffered, but I am very proud of you. I have no words to truly express how happy I am, but I cannot be really happy because 2 people were killed.
And for Shim Jin-po, whose son, Shim Song-min, was one of the 2 hostages murdered by the Taliban, there would be no joyful reunion.
How could the Taliban kill him and throw his body in the street like a dog? That thought disgusts me. He was only trying to help children who had suffered in the war.
With rumours swirling that a ransom had been paid, Mr. Shim could not understand why his son had been allowed to die before a settlement was reached. And he blamed the South Korean government.
In order to perform such an important mission for saving people's lives, the envoy should be an expert. But he was not professional enough, and he has accelerated the death of my son.
The 21 surviving hostages are at last back home, 51 days after they left. But their ordeal is not over. After a summer of suffering, the time for healing has only just begun.